By the time Alara Vance was finished, the entire boardroom was silent, gripped by a quiet terror that was far louder than their earlier shouting. But they were laughing, or at least smirking with the smug confidence of the untouchable. When she had first walked in for her final, excruciating interview, the memory of that day, of their dismissive glances and condescending tones, had become the fuel for an engine of retribution so precise and so devastating that no one in that room could have possibly conceived of it. They saw a hopeful, slightly nervous applicant from a state school, a young woman with a portfolio that was, as they'd put it, surprisingly robust for her background. They saw someone asking for a place at their table. They never once imagined she had the power to not just flip the table, but to buy the restaurant, the block, and the deed to the land it was all built on. The journey from that humiliating rejection to this moment of absolute, silent power had been a long and secret one. It began not with anger, but with a profound and soul-crushing heartbreak, delivered by the one person she thought was on her side. The third rejection email from Aperture Innovations had arrived on a Tuesday. It was brief, colder than the previous two. While we were impressed with your qualifications, we have decided to move forward with other candidates whose experience more closely aligns with our current needs. It was corporate speak for no. And please stop trying. Alara had stared at the words on her laptop screen, the cursor blinking patiently next to the sterile sign-off. She felt a familiar hollowness spread through her chest. 3 times. 3 times she had applied, each time for a different but related role in their research and development division. 3 times she had made it to the final round. And 3 times she had been turned away at the very last step. She had spent weeks preparing for this last interview. She had studied every product line, memorized the names and histories of the board members, and rehearsed her answers until her voice was hoarse. Her portfolio was immaculate, filled with innovative concepts and detailed schematics that went far beyond the scope of the junior developer role she was applying for. She knew, with a certainty that was almost physical, that she was more than qualified. She was better than qualified. Her ideas could revolutionize their stagnant product lines. But something was holding her back, some invisible barrier she couldn't see but could feel every time she walked into their gleaming, minimalist lobby. That evening, she was supposed to be celebrating. Or, more accurately, Julian was supposed to be celebrating, and she was supposed to be the supportive fiancé at his side. He had just been named the lead on a major new project at Aperture, a significant step up the corporate ladder. They were at an upscale restaurant with his parents, a place with white tablecloths so stiff they could have stood on their own, and waiters who moved with a silent, unnerving grace. The air was thick with the scent of money and self-satisfaction. Julian's mother, Eleanor, a woman who wore her pearls like armor, had raised a glass of champagne. "To Julian," she'd said, her voice carrying across the table with practiced authority. Another step toward the top. "We are so proud." Julian, handsome and radiating a smug, polished charm, had leaned over and kissed Alara's cheek. The gesture felt performative, a display for his parents. "We'll get you in there yet, honey," he'd whispered, loud enough for them to hear. "Don't you worry." Alara had forced a smile, the rejection email feeling like a lead weight in her gut. She had told him the news in the car on the way over, and he had offered a perfunctory, "Oh, bad luck." Next time now, in front of his parents, he was playing the part of the encouraging partner, and the insincerity of it made her stomach clench. "Another rejection, dear?" Eleanor had asked, her eyes holding a look of pity that was far more insulting than outright disdain. "That's the third one, isn't it?" Alara had just nodded, taking a sip of water. She didn't want to talk about it. She didn't want to dissect her failure under the clinical gaze of the Vances. But Eleanor was not one to let things go. "Well, perhaps it's for the best," she'd continued, setting her glass down with a delicate click. "Aperture is a very demanding environment. The pressure is immense. Not everyone is cut out for it." Julian's father, a quiet man who let his wife do most of the social heavy lifting, had grunted in agreement. "It's about pedigree, you know. The right schools, the right connections. It's a club." The implication was clear. Alara, with her state university degree and her lack of a storied family name, was not a member. She was an outsider trying to peer through the windows. Alara had felt a flush of heat creep up her neck. She looked at Julian, hoping he would defend her, hoping he would say something, anything to shut them down. He had just shrugged, a small, helpless gesture. "They have a certain way of doing things," he'd said, avoiding her eyes. He then turned to her, his voice softening into a tone of gentle condescension, the kind one uses on a child who has just been told that Santa Claus isn't real. "Look, Alara, I know how much you want this, but maybe Mom is right. Maybe it's time to accept your limitations. It's not a failure. It's just reality." The word hung in the air between the phrase that would echo in her mind for months, the phrase that she would one day return to him, gift-wrapped in his own ruin. "You have the passion, Alara. I'll give you that," Julian had said, reaching across the table to pat her hand as if she were a distraught pet. "But you just don't have the pedigree. It's not your fault. It's just the way the world works." It wasn't the rejection from Aperture that broke her. It was this. It was the calm, dismissive cruelty from the man who was supposed to be her partner, her champion. It was the look in his eyes that said he agreed with his parents completely. He saw her not as his equal, but as something lesser, something that needed to be managed and placated. The love she thought they shared suddenly felt like a transaction, one where he held all the power. She had pulled her hand away from his. The table fell silent. Eleanor watched her, a small, triumphant smile playing on her lips. She had won. She had successfully reinforced the family hierarchy, putting the little outsider firmly back in her place. Alara had stood up, her chair scraping softly against the polished floor. "Excuse me," she'd murmured, her voice miraculously steady. She walked away from the table, past the silent waiters and the other patrons, and out into the cool night air. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She had seen everything she needed to see in their smug, satisfied faces. The relationship was over. Her old life was over. Standing on that cold pavement, the city lights blurring through the unshed tears in her eyes, a new resolve began to crystallize from the wreckage of her heart. They thought she didn't have the pedigree. She would show them what real power looked like. The story of that power began long before Alara ever met Julian. In a cluttered workshop that smelled of sawdust and soldering flux. She was raised by her maternal grandfather, Silas Vance. He was a man out of time, a quiet genius who cared more for the elegant solution to a problem than for the fame or fortune it might bring. While other men his age were playing golf or planning their retirement cruises, Silas was hunched over a workbench, sketching schematics on graph paper and muttering to himself about quantum tunneling and silicon impurities. He had been a professor of engineering at a small, unassuming college for most of his life, but his real work happened at home. He was an inventor, a prolific and brilliant one. He saw the world in terms of systems, of inputs and outputs, of elegant designs and clumsy workarounds. He taught Alara how to think, not just what to think. He gave her a dismantled radio for her 6th birthday and a book on Fortran for her 10th. While other girls were playing with dolls, Alara was learning how to code, how to build circuits, how to see the hidden architecture of the modern world. "Never be impressed by the shiny case, Ellie," he used to tell her, tapping a new piece of consumer electronics with his finger. "The magic isn't in the plastic. It's in the chips. It's in the logic. Understand the logic, and you understand everything." What Alara didn't fully comprehend until much later was that her grandfather hadn't just taught her about the logic. In some cases, he had written it. In the late 1980s, he had developed and patented a revolutionary method for fabricating semiconductor wafers. It was a breakthrough that dramatically increased processing speed and efficiency. But Silas had no interest in starting a company or becoming a public figure. He detested boardrooms and marketing meetings. So he did something unorthodox. He licensed the patent. He sold the exclusive rights to use his process to a handful of major tech corporations, not for a lump sum, but for a small perpetual royalty on every single microprocessor they produced using his method. It was a deal that the short-sighted executives of the time saw as a bargain. They got the golden goose, and all it cost them was a few golden eggs. They didn't realize that Silas had just secured a river of gold that would flow for decades, growing from a trickle to a torrent as the digital age exploded. He had lived simply, pouring most of the money into a carefully managed investment portfolio and a series of trusts. He never told Alara the full extent of their wealth. He wanted her to grow up hungry, motivated, and untainted by the sense of entitlement that he saw as a poison. He wanted her to build her own worth, to sharpen her own skills, so that she would be valued for who she was, not what she had. When he passed away peacefully in his sleep, Alara was 22, just finishing her degree. She was devastated. She had lost her mentor, her friend, her entire family in one quiet morning. A week later, a man in a simple gray suit had knocked on her door. His name was Arthur Gable, and he introduced himself as her grandfather's financial advisor and the executor of his estate. They had met in a small, discreet law office downtown. Mr. Gable was a man of few words, with kind eyes and an air of unshakable competence. He had handed Alara a thick binder and a small, leather-bound ledger. The binder contained the portfolio. The numbers were staggering, a constellation of stocks, bonds, and real estate holdings that stretched into the 9-figure range. The royalty streams from the patents alone were worth more than the annual GDP of some small countries. Alara had stared at the pages, her mind unable to process the sheer scale of it. She had known her grandfather was comfortable, but this was something else entirely. This was a fortune. Then, Mr. Gable had given her a letter from Silas, written in his familiar, spidery handwriting. "My dearest Ellie," it began. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and you are likely feeling a bit overwhelmed. Do not be afraid of this. It is just a tool like a hammer or a soldering iron. It can be used to build or to destroy. The choice is yours. For years, I have watched you grow, and I have seen your brilliant mind and your good heart. That is your true inheritance. This money is just a responsibility." The letter went on, but it was the final paragraph that would become her guiding principle. "I have only one piece of advice for you. Live your life. Build your own worth before you ever have to use mine. Find people who love you for the contents of your character, not the contents of your bank account. Then, when you know who you are and who you can trust, you can decide what to build. Money is a tool, not a throne. Use it to build a table big enough for everyone who deserves a seat." And so she had left the fortune under Mr. Gable's expert management, drawing only a modest living stipend. She moved to a new city, took a small apartment, and set out to make her own way in the world, just as Silas had advised. She wanted to earn her place. She wanted to be judged on her merits alone. It was during this time that she met Julian. He was everything she thought she wanted. He was ambitious, driven, and successful. He worked at Aperture Innovations, a company she had admired from afar for years. He was charming, and he seemed genuinely interested in her work, in her ideas. He came from a good family, as he often reminded her, and he moved through the world with an easy confidence that she, with her quiet workshop upbringing, found captivating. She had fallen in love, and she had kept her secret. She told him her grandfather had been a professor and had left her a small inheritance, enough to be comfortable but not enough to change her life. It was a lie of omission, but it felt necessary. She was following Silas's advice. She was testing the world, testing the people in it. Looking back now, in the cold, clear light of his betrayal, she could see the red flags she had so willfully ignored. The way he would listen to her complex technical ideas and then summarize them in laughably simplistic terms. The way he would subtly steer conversations in social settings away from her work and toward his own accomplishments. The gentle negging, disguised as teasing, about her clothes, her non-designer handbag, her lack of interest in the vacuous socialites his family admired. She had mistaken his condescension for guidance, his control for concern. She had wanted so badly to be loved for herself that she had allowed herself to be diminished, to be molded into the person he and his family wanted her to be. The dinner party had not been a revelation. It had been a confirmation of a truth she had been too afraid to face. They would never see her as an equal. To them, she would always be the girl from the state school, the charity case, the project. A support structure. The morning after she walked out of that restaurant, she did not cry. The hurt had burned itself out overnight, leaving behind something cold, hard, and incredibly clear. She took out the small, leather-bound ledger her grandfather had left her. It was the one physical object she had kept with her, a tangible link to him. She had flipped through it occasionally, marveling at the neat columns and precise entries, but she had never truly studied it. Now she did. She opened it to the section on patents. Her finger traced the entry for patent 74B Delta, method for submicron photolithography. Next to it was a list of licensees. Her eyes stopped on a familiar name, Aperture Innovations Incorporated. The entry detailed the original licensing agreement and the staggering annual royalty payments they had been making for over 2 decades to a holding company named Silas Vance Holdings, LLC. A slow smile spread across Alara's face. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of a predator that has just spotted a fatal weakness in its prey. They had rejected her 3 times. They had called her unworthy. They had told her she didn't have the pedigree. And all along, they had been paying rent to her grandfather, and now to her, for the very ground their empire was built on. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she had not called in over a year. "Mr. Gable," she said when the familiar, calm voice answered. "It's Alara Vance." "Miss Vance," he replied, his tone professional as always, but with an underlying warmth. "Is everything all right?" "Everything is perfect," Alara said, her voice devoid of any emotion. "The experiment is over. It's time to get to work. I need you to start liquidating a few assets. We're going shopping." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "And what is it we're shopping for, Miss Vance?" Alara looked at the name on the ledger. Aperture Innovations. The first step was not aggression but information. Alara knew from her grandfather that the best way to win a war was to know the battlefield better than your opponent. She needed to understand Aperture not as an aspirational brand, but as a business. A collection of assets, liabilities, strengths, and, most importantly, weaknesses. She met with Mr. Gable in a discreet, anonymous office suite they rented by the month. It was a sterile space with gray walls and generic furniture. A perfect blank canvas for the masterpiece of corporate revenge she was about to paint. "Buying a publicly traded company is not like buying a car, Miss Vance," Mr. Gable had explained, his fingers steepled. "You can't just walk in and write a check. A hostile takeover is a delicate, and often brutal, affair. If they get wind of what you're doing, they can mount a defense. They can issue new shares, find a white knight investor, poison pills. It can get messy and expensive." "I don't want it to be messy," Alara said. "I want it to be surgical. I don't just want to buy it. I want to walk in, declare victory, and have them be powerless to stop it. I want them to have no idea it's even happening until it's already over." Mr. Gable had allowed himself a small, appreciative smile.
A silent coup.
"I like it." Ambitious, he leaned forward. "To do that, we need leverage. We need to find their vulnerabilities. Financial, legal, personal. We need to know where all the bodies are buried." He recommended a firm. Not a typical private investigation agency that dealt with sordid affairs, but a high-level corporate intelligence group, the kind of shadowy consulting firm that governments and hedge funds used to do their dirty work. They were expensive, discreet, and ruthlessly effective. Alara had authorized it without a second thought. "Spare no expense," she told him. "I want to know everything. I want to know their debt structure, their supply chain vulnerabilities, their interoffice politics. I want to know what the CEO eats for breakfast and who the board members are sleeping with. Everything." While the intelligence firm began its deep dive, Alara focused on a different kind of investigation. She started playing the part of the dutiful, slightly defeated fiancé. It was a role that disgusted her, but it was a necessary camouflage. She had called Julian the day after the disastrous dinner, her voice full of practiced contrition. "You were right," she'd said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "I was being unrealistic. I think I'll take a break from job hunting and focus on us. On the wedding. The relief in his voice was palpable. He was so quick to believe her surrender, so confident in his own superiority. I knew you'd see it my way, Elara, he'd said, his tone magnanimous. It's for the best. You'll be much happier. She had let him believe it. She had started looking at wedding venues online, discussing flower arrangements, and asking his mother's opinion on color palettes. Eleanor was in her element, finally able to mold Elara into a suitable accessory for her son. The Vances thought they were winning, that they had successfully tamed the ambitious girl and put her in her proper domestic box. This belief made them careless. It made them talk. During family dinners and social events, Elara became a ghost, a silent observer armed with a brilliant memory and a singular purpose. She listened. She listened to Julian complain about his boss, the CEO Alastair Finch. She listened to him brag about the creative ways he was managing his project's budget to ensure it came in on target. She listened to Eleanor gossip about the financial troubles of one of the board members. Every conversation, every casual remark, every piece of office gossip was a data point, a piece of the puzzle she was meticulously assembling. Meanwhile, the reports from the intelligence firm started coming in, delivered to a secure email address. They were a revelation. Aperture Innovations, from the outside a titan of the industry, was rotten from the inside. The company was heavily over-leveraged, carrying a massive amount of debt that was coming due. Their R&D pipeline, once the envy of the industry, had stagnated. They hadn't produced a truly innovative product in 5 years, instead relying on minor updates to their existing lines and the powerful brand recognition they had built in the past. And at the top, there was Alastair Finch. The CEO was a man who loved the trappings of power more than the responsibilities of it. The report detailed a pattern of reckless spending and potential embezzlement. Lavish business trips to exotic locations with no clear business purpose. An art collection for the corporate headquarters purchased at inflated prices from a gallery owned by his brother-in-law. A consulting firm on the payroll that did no discernible work but was registered to an address that traced back to a shell corporation Finch himself controlled. The most damning discovery, however, was about Julian. The creative budget management he had bragged about was, in fact, fraud. He had been systematically misallocating funds, shifting expenses from his project to other departments and falsifying progress reports to make his own performance look stellar. He was building his career on a foundation of lies, and he was either too arrogant or too stupid to realize he was leaving a digital paper trail a mile wide. Elara had read the report on Julian with a cold, detached fury. The man she had once loved, the man she had planned to marry, was a common thief in a bespoke suit. The betrayal no longer hurt. It simply fueled her resolve. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Mr. Gable's team finished their analysis of Aperture's financial dependencies. Just as Elara had suspected from her grandfather's ledger, the company was critically dependent on the technology licensed from Silas Vance Holdings. The royalty payments for Patent 74B, Delta accounted for a significant chunk of their annual operating expenses, but the technology itself was the bedrock of their flagship product line. Losing the license wouldn't just be a financial hit, it would be an extinction-level event. Their most profitable products would become instantly obsolete, impossible to manufacture without violating a patent held by the very woman they had scorned. The plan began to form in Elara's mind, elegant in its simplicity and brutal in its execution. It had 3 phases. Phase 1, the acquisition. Mr. Gable, operating through a series of anonymous shell corporations and offshore investment vehicles, would begin to quietly buy up Aperture stock. They would also buy their debt. Banks and other creditors, knowing the company was on shaky ground, would be happy to sell the debt at a discount to get it off their books. This would make Elara not just a shareholder, but also their primary creditor. Phase 2, the provocation. Elara would continue to play her part, lulling them into a false sense of security. She would let Julian and his family believe they had complete control, encouraging their arrogance to reach its peak. She needed them to be at their most smug, their most confident right before the fall. Phase 3, the reveal. Once she had secured a majority stake and held their debt, she would call an emergency board meeting. She would walk into that room not as an applicant, but as the owner. She would expose Finch's corruption, Julian's fraud, and then, as the final, devastating blow, she would pull the plug on the patent license. She wouldn't just take over the company. She would bring it to its knees and then offer to save it on her own terms. She had laid the plan out for Mr. Gable on a large whiteboard in their anonymous office. He had listened patiently, his expression unreadable. When she was finished, he had stood up and walked over to the board. He studied it for a long moment, then picked up a marker and circled one part of her diagram. "This is all brilliant, Miss Vance," he'd said. "Tactically sound. But this part," he tapped the circle, which contained the names of Julian and his family. "This is personal. Are you prepared for that?" Elara had looked at the name of the man who had broken her heart and dismissed her worth. She thought of his mother's condescending smile and his father's talk of pedigree. "Mr. Gable," she'd said, her voice like ice. "That's the entire point." The weeks that followed were a masterclass in deception. Elara threw herself into the charade with the same intensity she had once applied to her engineering projects. She created spreadsheets of wedding vendors, spent hours on the phone with caterers, and even went dress shopping with Eleanor, enduring the woman's endless stream of passive-aggressive critiques with a serene smile. "That cut is a bit ambitious for your figure, don't you think, dear?" Eleanor would say, eyeing a dress Elara had chosen. "Let's try something more forgiving." Elara would simply nod and agree. "You're right, Eleanor. Your taste is so much more refined." Every compliment she gave them was a twist of the knife they couldn't feel. Every act of submission was a step closer to their destruction. It was a strange, intoxicating power. Julian, meanwhile, was basking in the glow of his supposed success. His project was, on paper, hitting all its targets. He had been praised in a company-wide memo from Finch himself. He was becoming more arrogant by the day, more convinced of his own genius. The final provocation, the last act of cruelty that would seal his fate, came about a month before the planned wedding date. Aperture threw a large party to celebrate the successful completion of the first phase of Julian's project. It was held at a lavish hotel ballroom, a glittering affair filled with the city's corporate elite. Elara stood by his side, wearing a simple but elegant dress that Eleanor had grudgingly approved. She played the part of the proud fiancé perfectly, smiling and nodding as Julian accepted congratulations from his colleagues. Late in the evening, flush with champagne and adulation, Julian had taken the stage to give a speech. He thanked his team, he thanked the board, he thanked Alistair Finch for his visionary leadership. Then he turned his gaze to Elara, who was standing near the front of the crowd. "And finally," he'd said, his voice booming through the speakers, "I want to thank my beautiful fiancée, Elara." He paused, letting the crowd's attention settle on her. She could feel hundreds of pairs of eyes on her, and she fought the urge to shrink away. "She has been my rock through all of this," he continued, a smug smile on his face. "And I want to make a special toast to my lovely Elara for understanding that some of us are builders, and some of us are support structures, and both are valuable." The room erupted in polite applause. A few people chuckled at his clumsy attempt at a metaphor, but Elara heard it for what it was, the ultimate dismissal. He wasn't just putting her in her place in private anymore. He was doing it publicly in front of his entire professional world. He was defining her as an accessory to his greatness, a passive foundation upon which he could build his glorious career, a support structure. The phrase hit her with the force of a physical blow. But this time it didn't hurt. It was clarifying. It was the final piece of evidence she needed, the last justification for the scorched earth campaign she was about to unleash. Any lingering traces of guilt, any microscopic shred of doubt about the path she had chosen, evaporated in that moment. She had raised her glass to him, her expression a perfect mask of loving pride. "To the builder," she'd said, her voice just loud enough for those nearby to hear. He had beamed at her, completely oblivious. He thought he was receiving a compliment. He had no idea she was delivering a verdict. That night, after the party, she had sent a one-line email to Mr. Gable. "It's time. The execution was swift. The next morning, Mr. Gable's team, having already acquired 51% of Aperture's outstanding shares and a controlling interest in its debt, made their move. A formal notice was delivered to Alastair Finch's office. It was a legally binding demand for an emergency meeting of the board of directors, called by the new, unnamed majority shareholder. The notice sent a shockwave of panic through the executive suites of Aperture Innovations. Who was this new owner? Why had they been able to acquire such a large stake without anyone noticing? Finch had tried desperately to find out, calling his contacts on Wall Street, but the ownership was hidden behind a labyrinth of shell companies so complex it was impossible to trace. The meeting was scheduled for the following afternoon. The venue was the main boardroom on the top floor of the Aperture Tower, a room Alara had only seen in pictures. It was a space designed to project power, with a long, polished mahogany table, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city, and chairs that looked like thrones. On the day of the meeting, Alara chose her outfit with the care of a general preparing for battle. She wore a tailored suit of charcoal gray, severe and professional. Her hair was pulled back in a sleek, no-nonsense style. She wore minimal makeup and no jewelry except for a simple watch. She was not the soft, accommodating fiancé. She was not the nervous, hopeful applicant. She was the executioner. She met Mr. Gable and a small team of forensic accountants in the lobby. They were all dressed in similarly sober business attire. They looked like an invading army. "Are you ready, Miss Vance?" Mr. Gable asked, his voice low. Alara took a deep breath. "I was born ready," she said, quoting her grandfather. "Let's go to work." They took a private elevator to the top floor. As they ascended, Alara could feel the city spreading out below her. She thought of the first time she had come to this building, full of hope and nerves, dreaming of being a small part of it. Now she was coming to claim all of it. The mood in the boardroom was tense and angry. Alastair Finch sat at the head of the table, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. The other board members, a collection of aging, complacent men, muttered amongst themselves. And there, halfway down the table, was Julian. He looked nervous, but also excited, as if he was witnessing a thrilling corporate drama. He had no idea he was one of the lead actors, and that his part was that of the villain about to receive his comeuppance. He saw Alara enter and his face registered a brief flash of confusion. What was she doing here? He probably assumed she was delivering a forgotten document for him, playing the part of the helpful fiancé one last time. The door swung open, and the chatter in the room died. Alara walked in first, her heels clicking decisively on the polished marble floor. She was followed by Mr. Gable and his team, who carried briefcases full of documents. She didn't hesitate. She walked to the empty chair at the opposite end of the table from Finch, a place reserved for a visiting dignitary or a major client, and remained standing. Mr. Gable and his team arranged themselves behind her. The silence stretched, thick with confusion and hostility. It was Finch who broke it, his voice dripping with venom. "And who the hell are you?" he demanded, his eyes narrowed to slits. "This is a private meeting of the board." "Security." Julian, finally realizing something was terribly wrong, half rose from his seat. "Alara? What are you doing? You can't be in here." Alara ignored him. Her gaze was locked on Finch. She let the silence hang for another beat, savoring their confusion, their dawning fear. "It is a private meeting," she said, her voice calm and clear, easily filling the cavernous room. "And as the representative of the entity that now owns 51% of this company's stock and 65% of its debt, I believe I am in the right place." The effect of her words was like a grenade detonating in the silent room. There was a collective gasp. Board members stared at her, then at each other, their faces a mixture of disbelief and horror. Finch's jaw literally dropped. He looked as if he had been slapped. Julian sank back into his chair, his face ashen. He stared at her as if he was seeing a ghost. This calm, authoritative woman was not the Alara he knew. This was not the pliable, gentle girl he had so easily dismissed. That's not possible, Finch stammered, his bravado evaporating. We would have known. The SEC filings were perfectly legal and perfectly opaque. Mr. Gable interjected smoothly, stepping forward. My associates and I are very good at what we do. Aperture Innovations has a new majority owner, and you are all now meeting with her. The reality of the situation began to sink in, and the fear in the room curdled into panic. Julian, desperate to reassert some semblance of the world order he understood, found his voice. Alara, this is insane, he cried, his voice cracking. You can't do this. You don't understand this world. You don't have the background, the training. You don't have the pedigree. There it was, the word, the insult that had started it all. He had thrown it at her like a weapon, his last, desperate attempt to put her back in the box he had created for her. Alara turned her head slowly and looked at him. For the first time since she entered the room, she allowed a flicker of emotion to show in her eyes. Pure, unadulterated ice. You're right, Julian, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying more weight than all their shouting. I don't have your pedigree. She paused, letting the words hang in the air. Then she reached into her own briefcase and pulled out a single object, her grandfather's small, worn, leather-bound ledger. She walked the length of the table and placed it down in front of Finch with a soft, definitive thud. I have the one that matters, she said. She flipped the ledger open to the bookmarked page. I own patent 74B Delta, the patent your entire flagship product line, and therefore your entire company, is built on. The company you thought was so far above me has been paying my family rent for 25 years. Finch stared at the ledger, at the familiar patent number, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. The other board members leaned in, their expressions morphing from anger to sheer, abject terror. They finally understood. This wasn't a hostile takeover. It was an execution. Alara nodded to Mr. Gable, who delivered the coup de grace. He stepped forward and placed a single sheet of paper on top of the open ledger. His voice was neutral, the voice of a man simply stating a fact, which made the words all the more devastating. The holding company that owns patent 74B, Delta, has been under Miss Vance's control for the past 5 years, he announced to the silent room. As of this morning, exercising her rights under Section 12, subsection C of the licensing agreement, she has terminated that agreement with Aperture Innovations, effective immediately. The cause for termination is gross financial mismanagement and executive malfeasance, which constitutes a material breach of contract. A silence fell over the room. It was not an empty silence. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, filled with the sound of collapsing worlds. The blood drained from Finch's face. One of the older board members made a small choking sound. Julian looked like he was going to be physically ill. He stared at Alara, his mouth opening and closing, but no sound came out. In that moment, they all understood the totality of their ruin. Without that license, Aperture Innovations was nothing. Their stock was worthless. Their products were illegal to manufacture. They were a hollowed-out brand with a mountain of debt and no way to pay it. They were, in a word, finished. Alara remained standing at the head of the table, a silent, implacable judge who had just delivered a sentence from which there was no appeal. The smirks, the condescension, the casual cruelty, it had all led to this terrible, beautiful, and absolute silence. The silence in the boardroom was finally broken not by a person, but by the quiet click of a briefcase latch. One of Mr. Gable's associates, a stern-faced woman with glasses, stepped forward and began placing thick, bound documents in front of each board member. These are the preliminary findings of our forensic accounting team, Mr. Gable stated, his voice cutting through the tension. They detail a multi-year pattern of embezzlement, wire fraud, and securities violations, originating from the CEO's office. He placed a particularly thick volume directly in front of Alistair Finch. This one is yours, Mr. Finch. It includes detailed records of the slush fund you managed through the shell company Viridian Consulting, the inflated invoices from the art gallery owned by your brother-in-law, and the ghost employees on the international payroll. We estimate the total amount you have defrauded from this company and its shareholders to be in excess of $15 million. Finch, who had been staring blankly at the ledger, finally snapped. This is slander. Lies. I'll have you all in court for the rest of your lives, he shrieked, his voice thin and reedy. Alara didn't even flinch. You will be in court, Mr. Finch, she said calmly. But you won't be the one filing the lawsuit, she nodded toward the door. As if on cue, it opened, and 2 uniformed police officers and 2 plainclothes detectives entered the room. The color drained completely from Finch's face. He looked at the officers, then back at Alara, his eyes wide with a terror that was immensely satisfying to watch. Alistair Finch, one of the detectives said, his voice flat and official. You are under arrest for suspicion of grand larceny, wire fraud, and embezzlement. Please stand up and place your hands behind your back. Finch was paralyzed, unable to move. The officers had to physically pull him from his chair. As they cuffed him, his composure shattered completely. He began to babble, protesting his innocence, threatening lawsuits, his dignity dissolving with every pathetic word. As the officers led him from the room, Alara's gaze swept over the remaining board members, who were all staring at their own copies of the incriminating reports, their faces pale. Her eyes finally landed on Julian. He was a wreck. His expensive suit seemed to hang off him. His face was slick with sweat, and his eyes were darting around the room as if looking for an escape route that didn't exist. Another of the accountants placed a separate, smaller file in front of him. Mr. Vance, the accountant said, this report details your activities, specifically, the systematic falsification of project budget reports, misallocation of funds to the tune of nearly $2 million, and fraudulent progress statements made to the board and to shareholders. Julian looked from the file to Alara, his expression a desperate, pleading mess. Alara, please, he whispered, his voice hoarse. It was just creative accounting. Everyone does it. It's how the game is played. It's not a game, Julian, Alara said, her voice cold. It's fraud. You lied. You stole from this company to make yourself look good. You built your entire career here on a foundation of deceit. I can fix it, he pleaded, his voice rising in panic. We can fix it. Don't do this. Think about us. The wedding. Alara let out a short, sharp laugh, devoid of any humor. The wedding? The wedding is off, Julian. It has been for months. You were just too arrogant to notice, she leaned forward slightly. You told me some of us are builders and some of us are support structures. It turns out you were neither. You were just a termite, eating away at the foundations while pretending to hold up the roof. She straightened up and addressed the entire room. Mr. Julian Vance is fired, effective immediately. Security will escort him from the building. His assets will be frozen pending a full civil suit to recover the funds he misappropriated. 2 corporate security guards, who had entered with the police, moved to stand behind Julian's chair. He looked at Alara, his face a mask of utter betrayal and disbelief, as if he couldn't comprehend that she was capable of this. He, the builder, the man with the pedigree, was being fired and disgraced by the little support structure he had so thoroughly underestimated. As the guards led him away, he was still muttering her name, a pathetic, broken mantra. With Finch and Julian gone, a new kind of silence fell on the room. It was the silence of terrified surrender. The remaining board members, all implicated to varying degrees by the culture of complacency and corruption Finch had fostered, sat frozen in their chairs, awaiting their fate. Alara let them stew in it for a full minute. Then she spoke, her voice now carrying the full weight of her new authority as owner, CEO, and creditor. Aperture Innovations, as you know it, is dead, she announced. It died of arrogance, corruption, and a fundamental lack of vision. Today, we begin the process of building something new in its place. A company focused on actual innovation, on integrity, and on merit. She looked around the table, meeting the eyes of each person. Some of you will be a part of that future. Some of you will not. Your positions are not secure. Your past performance is irrelevant. Starting tomorrow, you will be evaluated on one thing and one thing only: the value you can bring to the new aperture. Her gaze then fell on a young woman sitting at the far end of the table, a junior board member named Priya Chen. Alara remembered her from her interviews. Priya had been the only one who had treated her with genuine respect, the only one who had asked intelligent, insightful questions about her portfolio instead of her university. She had been kind. "Ms. Chen," Alara said, her tone softening slightly. The young woman looked up, startled. "Effective immediately, you are promoted. You will be the new head of research and development. Your budget is doubled. I want you to assemble a team of the hungriest, most brilliant minds you can find, regardless of their background or pedigree. I want you to start building the future. Your first team meeting is tomorrow at 8 a.m. Priya stared at her, speechless, a look of dawning hope on her face. It was a small gesture, but it sent a powerful message to everyone in the room. The old guard was out. The era of merit had begun. This was not just about destruction. It was about creation. Alara then addressed the rest of the board. "The company is technically insolvent. However," she paused, letting the fear spike one last time, "I am willing to personally refinance the company's debt and, as the owner of Patent 74B Delta, grant a new, temporary operating license." A collective sigh of relief went through the room. "This is not a gift," she continued, her voice hardening again. "It is a lifeline, and I can cut it at any time. My team," she gestured to Mr. Gable and the accountants, "will be overseeing a complete audit of every department. There will be restructuring. There will be layoffs. And there will be zero tolerance for the kind of behavior that brought this company to the brink of collapse. Is that understood?" A chorus of mumbled yes and understood came from around the table. "Good," Alara said. She picked up her grandfather's ledger, the source of it all, and tucked it back into her briefcase. "This meeting is adjourned. I'll see you all tomorrow morning. Be ready to work." She turned and walked out of the boardroom without a backward glance, leaving behind a group of broken men to contemplate the smoking ruins of their world. As she stepped into the elevator, the doors sliding shut to seal her away from the wreckage, she finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of her victory. It wasn't just triumph. It was a profound sense of justice, of a balance restored. Later that evening, she stood alone in the CEO's office. Finch's personal effects had already been boxed up. The ridiculously expensive and likely fraudulent art was still on the walls, but it would be gone by morning. The huge mahogany desk was empty. She walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked out at the city lights twinkling below. It was the same view the board had, but she was seeing it with different eyes. She wasn't just looking at a city. She was looking at a future she was about to build. Mr. Gable entered the office quietly and handed her an envelope. "I thought you might want to see this," he said. It was a letter. She recognized the spidery handwriting immediately. It was from her grandfather, Silas. "Mr. Gable was instructed to give this to you only if you ever took a controlling interest in a publicly traded company," he explained. Alara's hands trembled slightly as she opened it. "My dearest Ellie," it read, "if you are reading this, then you have done something bold. You have stepped onto the field of battle. I am proud of you not for the victory, but for the courage it took to fight. Remember what I told you. This power, this money, it is a tool. Some will tell you it's a weapon, and they are not wrong. It can be used to tear down that which is corrupt and unjust. But a weapon is a poor tool for building. Once the ground is cleared, you must put the sword away and pick up the trowel. Build something that lasts. Build something that matters. Build a table big enough for everyone who deserves a seat. The world has enough kings on thrones. What it needs are more master builders at the workbench. Be a builder, Ellie. Your loving grandfather, Silas." Tears welled in Alara's eyes as she read the letter, the first tears she had shed through the entire ordeal. They weren't tears of sadness or anger, but of gratitude and love. He had known her so well. He had seen the path she would walk long before she ever set foot on it. She wiped her eyes, folded the letter carefully, and placed it in her pocket. She turned back to the window, her resolve hardening once more. The demolition was over. It was time to start building. A year can change everything. 12 months after Alara Vance walked into the Aperture boardroom and detonated the old world, a new one had risen in its place, stronger and more vibrant than ever. The name on the building was the same, but inside, everything was different. The first few months had been a whirlwind of relentless work. Alara, with Mr. Gable as her trusted COO, had conducted a radical overhaul of the entire company. The audit had uncovered more rot, and the subsequent layoffs were deep and painful, but necessary. The old guard, the complacent executives who thrived on politics and pedigree, were gone. In their place, Alara had promoted from within and hired from outside, looking for one thing: talent. She didn't care where they went to school, who their parents were, or what their last name was. She cared about what they could do. Priya Chen, the young woman Alara had promoted to head of R&D on that first day, had proven to be a visionary. Freed from the bureaucratic constraints of the old regime and given a massive budget, she had unleashed a torrent of innovation. Her teams were working on projects that the old Aperture would have deemed too risky or too ambitious. The energy in the labs was electric, a palpable hum of excitement and discovery. Alara had transformed the corporate culture. The hierarchical, top-down structure was replaced with a more collaborative model. She instituted an open-door policy, and she meant it. Any employee, from a janitor to a lead engineer, could schedule a meeting with her. She ate in the company cafeteria, walked the floors of the labs, and knew the names of hundreds of her employees. She was not a distant queen on a throne. She was, as her grandfather had advised, a master builder at the workbench. The results were spectacular. Aperture launched its first new product under her leadership just 10 months after the takeover. It was a revolutionary piece of hardware based on a concept Alara herself had developed years ago, an idea that had been in the portfolio she had submitted with her first failed application. It was an immediate, runaway success. The market responded enthusiastically, and Aperture's stock, which had plummeted after the news of the takeover and Finch's arrest, began to soar to unprecedented heights. The company wasn't just saved. It was reborn, more profitable and more respected than it had ever been under Finch's corrupt reign. Alara also made good on her promise to build a bigger table. She established the Silas Vance Scholarship Foundation, a multi-million-dollar fund dedicated to providing full scholarships for gifted students from underprivileged backgrounds to study science, technology, engineering, and math. The first class of Vance Scholars had just been announced, a diverse group of brilliant, hungry young minds who, like her, might otherwise have been overlooked by a system obsessed with pedigree. The fate of the antagonists was a grim but satisfying footnote. Alistair Finch had been convicted on multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement. Stripped of his wealth and his reputation, he was now serving a 7 to 10-year sentence in a medium-security federal prison. His name, once a symbol of corporate power, was now a cautionary tale. Julian's downfall was less dramatic but no less complete. He had avoided prison time by cooperating with the prosecution against Finch, but his career was in ruins. Blacklisted from the tech industry and facing a mountain of legal fees and civil penalties, he had been forced to sell his expensive condo and move back in with his parents. The last Alara had heard, he was working a commission-based job selling enterprise software for a third-rate company. A humiliating fall from grace for the man who had seen himself as a builder. His family's social standing had crumbled along with their son's career. The Vances, once proud gatekeepers of their elite circle, were now social pariahs, their name tainted by scandal. Alara rarely thought of them. They were ghosts from a past life, their power over her so completely broken that they barely registered as a memory. Her life was full, focused on the present and the future. And that future included someone new. His name was Liam. He was a brilliant and renowned architect she had met when she commissioned a new, state-of-the-art campus for Aperture. He was kind, witty, and possessed a quiet confidence that was the polar opposite of Julian's loud arrogance. He wasn't intimidated by her power or her wealth. He was drawn to her mind, her passion, and her strength. He loved her for the contents of her character, just as Silas had hoped. One evening, a year to the day after the takeover, Alara was at a gala celebrating the launch of the Vance Foundation. She stood on a balcony overlooking the event, Liam by her side. Below them, the first group of scholarship recipients mingled with the top engineers and scientists from Aperture, the air buzzing with excitement and possibility. Liam put his arm around her. "Look at what you've built," he said softly, his voice full of genuine admiration. "Not just the company. All of this." Alara looked out at the crowd, at the faces of the bright young students whose futures she was helping to shape. She thought of her grandfather's workshop, of the rejection emails, of Julian's condescending voice telling her she lacked pedigree. All of it, the pain and the struggle, had been a necessary part of the journey. They were the fire that had forged her. A profound sense of peace settled over her, a feeling of rightness that went bone deep. She had not just won. She had created something good out of the wreckage of something bad. She had cleared the corrupt ground and had built something new, something that would last. She leaned her head on Liam's shoulder, a genuine, happy smile on her face. The rejections, the humiliation, the heartbreak, they were not the end of her story. They were the beginning. They were the pressure that had turned a lump of coal into a diamond. She had learned the most important lesson of all, a truth she now carried with her every day. You must never, ever let someone else's small-minded, limited definition of your worth become your own reality. You must never accept the box they try to put you in. When the world tells you that you don't have the right pedigree to sit at the table, don't just demand a seat. Go out and build a better table. Or, if you have to, simply buy the whole damn building and show them you own the very ground the pedigree was built on. She was no longer just Alara Vance, the applicant. She was Alara Vance, the builder. And she was just getting started.